Welcome, nocturnal historians. Tonight we're not following generals, or flags, or heroic speeches. Instead, we trace the quiet journey of a single white tablet passed along a frozen trench. It kept men awake for days, erased fear, and turned farm boys into tireless ghosts of war. But when the high faded, their bodies collapsed, and their minds shattered in silence. This is the story of how a miracle drug helped build the Nazi war machine, and how it slowly dragged it to its own collapse. If forgotten truths keep you awake at night, like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what part of World War II do you think history chose to bury? You are there, in the biting winter of 1940. The exact date has slipped from your memory. A casualty of swirling snow and crushing exhaustion pressing against your eyelids. What you know, with a certainty that chills you more than the wind, is that you are being moved from the quiet, desolate Western Front. Your unit is shuttled eastward, towards an unknown, colder destiny. The train, a metal snake hissing steam into the frigid air, grinds to a halt at a small, forgotten station. With each shriek of metal on metal, a shudder runs through the packed carriage, not just from the cold, but from a deeper, more profound anxiety. As the doors slide open with a groaning sigh, a blast of wind rushes in, an invisible assailant carrying the acrid scent of coal dust, the metallic tang of iron, and the undeniable, palpable odor of fear. It wraps around you, a cold embrace promising nothing but hardship. You step out onto the platform, your boots thudding dully on the frozen ground. The sky above, a vast, heavy lid of gray, hangs so low it seems to scrape the top of your helmet, threatening to press you further into the earth. There is no moon, no stars, no glimmer of solace, just a thick, unbroken blanket of cloud, smothering any hope of light. The road ahead is a treacherous ribbon of mud, churned and rechurned by the relentless passage of horses, heavy trucks, and the gargantuan weight of artillery. It's a viscous, slippery muck that grabs at your hobnailed boots with each step, demanding a Herculean effort to pull free. Every single stride feels like you are lifting not just your own weary leg, but the dead weight of another man, a ghost clinging to your ankles. Yet, no one dares to complain, to utter a single word of protest, even a sigh, would be to admit a weakness simply not tolerated here, on this desolate path to the east. Weakness, you understand, is a luxury no one can afford. A vulnerability that could easily become a death sentence in this unforgiving landscape. The rhythmic thud of hundreds of hobnailed boots on the sodden road becomes a haunting, monotonous symphony, punctuated only by ragged, freezing breaths that plume white in the air. This is the soundtrack to your marching night, a melody of pure endurance. Occasionally, in the vast, inky distance, a flicker of light erupts, a silent, startling flash of artillery fire. A test, perhaps. A grim reminder of the war that waits. The sudden white light stabs at your eyes, momentarily blinding you, before dying as quickly as it appeared, leaving the darkness in its wake feeling even thicker, more oppressive, more absolute than before. No one speaks. No one curses the cold, or the mud, or the unending march. The silence that envelops your column is colder, sharper, more cutting than the wind itself. Only the clipped, terse commands of your officers break the stillness. Keep formation. Don't stop. Each word is delivered with chilling finality, leaving no room for question or defiance. In the weary depths of your mind, a faint image flickers your small room back home, the familiar comfort, the quiet ticking of the wall clock. Here, on this endless road, time has ceased to exist, its batteries seemingly pulled from the cosmic mechanism. You whisper the question silently to yourself, a desperate plea swallowed by the vastness of the night. When will it be morning? The question falls into the mud, a forgotten thought, and no one, not even you, reaches down to retrieve it. For a brief, disorienting moment, a strange sensation washes over you, a feeling that you've been marching in this very night, in this very mud, in another life. Simply picking up where you left off, an eternal soldier in an eternal night. The night stretches around you, thinning and tightening like a rubber band pulled to its absolute limit, a band that promises never to snap, never to release you from its relentless grip. You don't know it yet, but from this night forward, night will cease to be merely a time of day. It will become a condition, a pervasive, inescapable state of being that will live deep inside you, shaping every moment. Before the relentless march east, before the mud and unending darkness consumed your days and nights, you found yourself in the bustling heart of Berlin. You remember standing outside a pharmacy, the crisp autumn air carrying the faint scent of baking bread and exhaust fumes. Your gaze was drawn to a glass display case, where a box of Pervitin sat prominently. The images on the box were a stark contrast to the grim realities that awaited you smiling women. Their hair perfectly coiffed, fresh-faced office clerks with bright, alert eyes adorned the packaging. Posters plastered nearby boasted innocent, alluring slogans, alert, productive, modern. In the vibrant, restless city, staying up all night, pushing the boundaries of human endurance, was marketed not as a burden, but as a lifestyle choice, a mark of sophistication. You, a young man from the quiet countryside, raised by the rhythms of the sun, found this idea deeply foreign, almost offensive. Your life was simple, dictated by the natural world: work when the sun climbed high, rest when it dipped below the horizon. The very concept of staying up all night to work sounded like a ludicrous city trick, an artificial attempt to cheat nature. In the barracks, however, a different narrative began to unfold. Some of the older, more seasoned boys would boast about small, white pills, handling them like precious candies. "This stuff," they'd whisper, their eyes wide with a strange, almost manic gleam, "lets you study all night, drive all night, patrol all night. You'll never feel tired." You kept your distance from these conversations, a quiet skepticism settling deep in your gut. Your rural upbringing had instilled in you a belief in natural strength, in simply enduring hardship. "They're weak," you'd think to yourself, a silent judgment forming. If you're tired, you're tired. Live with it. Why borrow strength from a bottle? Why cheat your body? Yet, as the relentless grind of East Prussia tightened its grip, as each day added another hour of grueling marching, another exhausting hour of guard duty, another another night stripped of sleep. Your deeply held beliefs began to crack, slowly, subtly. The constant demand on your body and mind chipped away at your resolve, making the forbidden fruit of Pervitin seem less like a weakness and more like a desperate possibility. One evening, in a drafty, cold wooden hut, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and stale tobacco, the sergeant emerged with a small strip of what looked like neatly arranged white tablets. They gleamed faintly in the dim light, like tiny, perfect beads. His voice, usually gruff and dismissive, took on a strangely calm, almost persuasive tone. "Not just students anymore," he explained, his gaze sweeping over your tired faces. "Drivers, factory workers, and now you. Anyone who doesn't take it falls behind. This is what keeps us moving." He held one out, his calloused fingers offering the small, white disc. You reached for it, your own hand trembling slightly, and as it settled into your palm, it felt cold, dry, impossibly light. It was a promise, whispered without words, a promise of continued motion, of defiance against the crushing weight of exhaustion, a promise that felt almost too easy, too tempting to believe. You didn't swallow it immediately. Instead, it found a temporary resting place in your uniform pocket, nestled ironically beside a worn photograph of your mother. A cruel, poignant arrangement. You mused, your mother's comforting smile and this stark chemical, both given the same impossible task to somehow keep you going. From time to time, your fingers would brush against the smooth, cold surface of the pill, feeling the dormant shape of a temptation that was still, for now, asleep. Outside the hut, the night refused to budge, its darkness stretching endlessly. Inside, your tiredness had transcended a mere feeling. It had transformed into a tangible threat, a heavy cloak that threatened to suffocate you. You didn't know it yet. But the first time you swallowed that small white tablet, the very meaning of night would change forever, twisting into something far more profound and sinister. Your first encounter with Pervitin, the true baptism into its potent grip, didn't occur in the desolate, frozen expanse of Russia, as you might expect. No, it unfolded much earlier, in the frenzied, lightning-fast chaos of the Blitzkrieg in 1940 during the invasion of the West. You remember it as a blur of motion, a relentless, non-stop assault after nearly 48 hours without a single moment of sleep. You were packed shoulder to shoulder in the back of a rumbling truck, its engine a monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate directly into your bones, accelerating your exhaustion. The vehicle cut a narrow path through the dense, oppressive darkness of the Ardennes forest, its headlights carving fleeting tunnels through the inky blackness. Every curve, every shadow, every sound of snapping branches heightened the tension, pulling you closer to the precipice of total collapse. Suddenly, the sergeant's voice cut through the drone and the rising dread. He moved through the swaying truck, his hand tossing a small white pill to each man. "Swallow it," he barked, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "You want to cross this forest in one go, without falling behind? Or do you want to fall asleep under enemy artillery fire?" The choice was stark, terrifyingly simple. Without hesitation, you swallowed the pill, pushing it down your dry throat. It slid with a bitter taste, mingling with the acrid smell of petrol fumes and the stale, collective sweat of the men around you. A mixture that, in that desperate moment, somehow promised efficiency, a chemical pathway to survival. At first, nothing happened. You felt only a slight acceleration of your heartbeat, a subtle tremor in your hands, a strange heat building in your head. A cynical thought formed, this is nonsense, just another trick. But then, a sudden, almost imperceptible shift. The world around you seemed to click up a notch, as if someone had subtly adjusted the brightness dial. The truck's headlights, moments before struggling to pierce the gloom, now reached further, cutting sharper, more defined paths through the darkness. The indistinct tree lines along the road seemed to sharpen, their individual branches suddenly visible, as if someone had wiped your eyes clean, banishing the fog of fatigue. Sleepiness didn't merely lessen, it vanished entirely, like a ghost dissipating in the dawn. The heavy, persistent weight behind your eyes, the one that had been pressing down on your thoughts for days, dissolved completely, revealing a cold, steady, almost unnerving alertness. When the truck finally stopped, spewing you and your comrades out into the night, you found yourselves moving with an astonishing, almost unnatural energy. You jumped, ran, crawled through the underbrush, fired your rifle with precision, rolled through the dirt, as if you'd just woken from a full, restorative night's rest. Your officers, witnessing this tireless surge, praised your iron spirit, mistaking the chemical's temporary magic for an innate, unyielding will. But you knew, deep down, that this spirit was rented, borrowed, not truly your own. The night around you didn't shrink or shorten in duration, but it seemed to shift backward, receding like scenery on a stage. You felt like an actor, performing tirelessly within a set made entirely of darkness, driven by an unseen force. From that moment on, whenever the familiar, crushing weight of exhaustion threatened to overwhelm you, your mind no longer drifted towards the comforting image of a warm bed. Instead, it conjured the image of that small, white pill. The bed, once a basic human necessity, now became a distant luxury. The pill, a cold, hard, inescapable necessity for survival. By the time your unit was eventually transferred to the east, the city trick of Pervitin was no longer an exotic curiosity. It had become an indispensable part of your gear, as essential as your rifle and your uniform. And in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the east, the nights were longer, colder, and the pills were destined to be used with an even greater, more ruthless frequency. As you journeyed deeper into the east, through the desolate landscapes of Poland, and then towards the forbidding Soviet border, the relentless pace intensified. The number of all-night marches grew exponentially, blurring into an indistinguishable, exhausting continuum until counting them became a meaningless exercise. After a few more doses of the white tablets, a chilling realization began to settle in your mind. A cold, hard truth that stripped away any illusion of assistance. This wasn't merely a boost, a temporary aid to combat fatigue. This was a rental contract, a grim agreement for the temporary use of your own body, signed in the quiet desperation of a freezing trench. You would find yourself on a frozen country roads, watching your legs churn forward, one mechanical step after another, your arms cradling the heavy rifle. but the profound sense that I decided this had begun to fade, dissolving like smoke in the bitter wind. There was a terrifying disconnect, a growing chasm between your conscious will and your physical actions. You were merely an observer, a passenger in your own skin. You recall a small engagement, a flash of chaotic violence near the ghost-ridden village of Smolensk. You remember climbing out of a muddy trench, the sudden surge of cold air against your face, sprinting across a snow-dusted field under a hail of enemy fire. Yet, amidst the terror and deafening roar of battle, you felt a strange, unsettling calm, an almost detached serenity that was utterly unnatural. Your hands, once clumsy with fatigue, now moved with almost surgical precision. They wrapped tourniquets around bleeding limbs, packed gauze into gaping wounds, performing these gruesome tasks with a speed and accuracy that surprised even you. It was as if they belonged to a pre-programmed nurse, a machine designed solely for efficiency, utterly divorced from the emotional chaos of war. When an officer's harsh bark of orders cut through the din, your mouth snapped out a crisp "Jawohl" before your conscious mind had even processed the command. The answer, sharp and immediate, arrived quicker than any thought or emotion could form behind it. The night, with its unending demands, had become a vast, desolate stage. Your body played the role of the brave, tireless soldier, an automaton driven by a chemical script. Meanwhile, the essential, human part of you, your true self, sat somewhere in the audience, watching this grim, relentless performance with a growing sense of detachment. Each pill you swallowed felt like another extension signed onto that insidious contract, pushing away the inevitable moment when you would finally have to face the crushing, accumulated bill for all that borrowed wakefulness. In the glazed, unnaturally wide eyes of your comrades, you saw yourself reflected a man who had become solid, unshakable, cold under fire. And when you looked at them, they appeared much the same to you, a silent, determined line of machines, all set to the same relentless, drug-driven mode. At night, in those fleeting moments before swallowing the next bitter pill, a tiny, insidious doubt would always surface. What if I don't? The whisper would ask, a fleeting question of defiance. But the answer, immediate and unyielding, would always arrive. Then you fall behind. And here, in this endless night, falling behind means dying. You understood, with chilling clarity, that when an entire unit leases its very bodies to the same potent substance, the army begins to march to the rhythm of a new kind of night, the chilling, relentless night of a single, drug-driven machine. They called the new tactic Blitzkrieg, a lightning war, a swift, decisive strike designed to overwhelm and paralyze the enemy. But from the cramped, freezing confines of a foxhole, immersed in its relentless execution, it felt nothing like a lightning strike. Instead, it was an unending, shared state of wakefulness, a collective insomnia imposed by the very nature of the conflict. In the sweeping offensive across Ukraine, you moved as part of an unstoppable, fluid force. You marched without pause, attacked with a ferocity born of chemical energy, pivoted on a dime, pursued retreating shadows relentlessly. You were a single, unbroken chain of headlights, stretching across the vast, bleak landscape. mirroring the strategic arrows drawn on some distant general's map. A river of metal and men that refused to accept stopping as an option. Night after night, the terrifying procession continued. Tanks, their heavy treads churning the earth into icy mud. Infantry, their boots thudding in unison. Artillery, their silent, menacing presence trailing behind. All flowed forward. It was a relentless, unstoppable current. A river of war that had no concept of rest or retreat. Your officers, their voices sharp and insistent, constantly drilled it into your weary minds. Time is a weapon. Whoever uses the night better wins. Back then, lost in the immediate demands of survival, you didn't fully grasp the grim, underlying truth of those words. You didn't understand that using the night meant burning the very bodies of your fellow soldiers, consuming their life force like fuel, like coal in a furnace. As the days and nights blurred into an indistinguishable continuum, you began to notice a chilling transformation among your comrades. The weary yawns, once a common sight, became fewer and fewer, then vanished altogether. Instead, eyes were wide, unnaturally so, pupils blown and dilated, staring past the immediate present as if chasing an image only they could perceive, an invisible phantom on the horizon. In the desolate Russian and Ukrainian villages, the few surviving civilians would watch you pass with a confused horror etched onto their faces. They saw an army that didn't tire, didn't pause for rest, didn't seem to sleep. A terrifying, unstoppable entity that moved more like a plague, a force of nature, than an army of men. Their bewildered stares spoke volumes, reflecting the inhumanity of your chemically sustained advance. Night, once the natural half of the day designated for rest, for retreat, for quiet contemplation, had been fundamentally redefined. It was no longer a time of respite in war. It had become, instead, the most efficient half. The time when you moved fastest, struck hardest, capitalized most ruthlessly on the enemy's natural need for sleep. On paper, you were sure. The reports flowing back to headquarters spoke in glowing terms of high morale and relentless advance. But from your vantage point in the dirt, the brutal reality was starkly clear this unending night. This impossible pace was being purchased with chemicals at the horrifying cost of your very lifespan, your sanity, your humanity. You understood, with a deep and unsettling certainty, that the ones drawing those strategic arrows on the maps, far from the mud and the blood, would soon want to taste that sleeplessness for themselves, to experience its intoxicating power. And that, you knew, was when reality itself would truly begin to slip from its fragile moorings. One night, deep within a dense forest near Smolensk, the silence was broken by the urgent call for your unit to report to the command tent. A sense of unease, a cold premonition, settled upon you. New attack orders were to be issued, a fresh wave of demands to be placed upon your already exhausted bodies and minds. As you stepped inside the tent, a faint, sickly yellow lamplight spilled over a vast map stretched taut across a rough wooden table. Red and blue arrows, stark and unforgiving, cut into the paper, crisscrossing it like fresh knife marks on pale skin, tracing paths of destruction and ambition. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, damp canvas, and an underlying nervous energy. Officers, their faces etched with grim intensity, argued over the map, their voices too fast, too sharp, too strained. Words tumbled out, stacking on top of each other, each man seemingly afraid of even 5 seconds of silence, as if quietness itself would expose a weakness, a faltering of their own resolve. It was a frenetic, almost desperate energy. In a corner of the table, amidst scattered papers and half-empty coffee mugs, a small wooden box lay open. Your eyes, now accustomed to noticing the subtle signs, immediately registered its contents, not just the usual cigarettes, but an array of tiny vials and ampules, their labels crammed with minuscule, almost unreadable letters. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the chemical support fueling this desperate intensity. Your captain, a man you had once regarded as being forged from pure iron, a figure of unwavering strength, now spoke incessantly, his ideas trampling one another in a relentless torrent of words. He seemed incapable of standing still, his body subtly twitching, as if any moment of pause, any break in the flow of his thoughts, would cause him to shatter. With a trembling finger, he traced a bold, aggressive arrow deep into enemy territory, across impassable rivers, through dense, dark forests, over countless unseen villages. It was a gesture that seemed to imply that distance and fatigue, those fundamental laws of human endurance, had somehow been erased from the very planet. "We attack through the night," he declared, his voice rising in a strange, almost feverish crescendo. "They can't stay awake like we can." His eyes, wide and shining with an unnerving intensity, held a glint that belonged more to the potent influence of a stimulant than to genuine strategic brilliance. In that moment, a chilling understanding dawned upon you, a realization that solidified the vague suspicions you had harbored. You weren't just a drugged army, a body of men fueled by chemical means. You were, far more terrifyingly, being commanded by brains that were themselves running their own private blitzkriegs, their own internal, chemically induced battles, inside their very skulls. And you knew, with a profound and unsettling certainty, that when a blitzkrieg inside the commander's minds met a sleepless army of drugged bodies, disaster was no longer a distant threat. It was merely a matter of timing, a ticking clock towards an inevitable, brutal reckoning. The dawn of June 22nd, 1941 should have been a momentous occasion, a clear delineation between the quiet before and the storm that followed. But for you, deep within the German war machine, there was no true dawn. When the order came to cross into the vast, unknown expanse of the Soviet Union, you were roused in what the clocks insisted was night, though for you, it was merely another indistinct shade of an unending, oppressive dark. Pervitin, the ubiquitous white tablet, was handed out with the casualness of candy, its presence a grim reassurance. The command was stark, brutally simple, cutting through the swirling confusion of pre-invasion jitters. No sleep. Today is history. Fueled by the potent chemical, you surged forward, an unstoppable tide. You smashed through flimsy border posts, their wooden structures splintering under your collective momentum. You cut through barbed wire, its vicious coils offering little resistance, and overran guard stations and sleepy villages with ruthless efficiency. Russian sentries, caught unprepared, were still half lost in their dreams, their minds struggling to comprehend the sudden, terrifying onslaught. Your minds, however, were operating at their brightest, most acute chemical peak, sharpened to an unnatural degree, ready for the kill. Each objective taken in the dark, each small victory carved out of the unending night, was marked by the violent ascent of flares. Launched into the sky, they became white wounds, tearing the darkness open, momentarily illuminating the scene below. Their blinding light rained down on faces that, by all rights, should have been utterly exhausted, sagging with the weight of sleep deprivation. But instead, those faces were wide-eyed, unnaturally alert, devoid of the telltale signs of fatigue. As the eastern sky began its slow, reluctant transformation from black to a pale, anemic gray, you were still running, still shooting, still shoving forward with relentless purpose. There was no distinct moment, no clear line drawn in the sand, that you could call the end of night, the beginning of day. It was all one continuous, chemically induced present. Breakfast, when it finally arrived, was at an absurd 11 o'clock in the morning, eaten underground, in the flickering, unsteady beams of flashlights, surrounded by the acrid smell of smoke and fear. Your body, still operating on a schedule warped by the pills, demanded sustenance at a time meant for night, even as the distant clocks insisted it was day. Victories, swift and brutal, came quickly, like waves of synthetic euphoria rolling from the distant map room, where red arrows moved across paper, down into the muddy trenches where you fought. But in your memory, each and every one of those triumphs carries the indelible label of night operation. There was no morning for sighs of relief, no quiet moments to count the fallen, to fully grasp the devastating cost of your relentless advance. There was only night glued to more night, an endless, unbroken chain of chemically induced wakefulness. Everything happened too fast, too furiously, to solidify into clear, coherent memories. The brutal, vivid details blurred into an indistinguishable haze, leaving only the chilling understanding that the campaign was pushing you further and further into places where no stimulant, no amount of chemical courage could ever truly defeat the insurmountable forces of distance and the unforgiving, brutal weather. The deeper you drove into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Soviet Union, the more the world around you seemed to change, stretching into an endless, desolate tableau. The roads grew impossibly longer, dissolving into tracks of mud and ice. The forests became thicker, darker, more ominous, their ancient trees cloaked in a chilling silence. The villages, once dotted with life, grew emptier, their abandoned homes standing like skeletal husks against the bleak horizon. And with this desolation, the nights themselves had fewer lights, just the occasional flicker of distant fires, the stark, blinding flash of flares, and the ever-present, shifting dance of shadows in the brutal, quick skirmishes that erupted without warning. The enemy ceased to be distinct, identifiable soldiers. Instead, they appeared like shadows, shaken loose from the dense tree line, mere indistinct forms that would rise. You would raise your rifle, fire, and then they would melt back into the impenetrable dark, leaving you uncertain if they were even real. After enough doses of Pervitin, after enough unbroken, sleepless nights, the sharp edges of reality began to fray, and you started to lose track of what was truly Russian and what was merely a gnarled, snow-laden tree. The line between man and environment, between enemy and natural obstacle, blurred into a dangerous, chaotic indistinction. You remember one instance with chilling clarity. A figure suddenly rose in front of your patrol, dark and menacing against the stark white of the snow. Your adrenaline surged, your rifle snapped up, and you fired without a second thought. The figure crumpled, falling silently into the pristine snow. As you approached, heart pounding in your chest, you realized with a sickening jolt that it was nothing but a fence post, draped with an old, tattered coat, its empty sleeves flapping gently in the wind. The shame was brief, quickly replaced by a deeper, more pervasive sense of confusion. The enemy had stopped being Russians in your chemically altered perception. They had become part of a larger, more encompassing enemy night, the dark. Ancient forest itself, the biting, whispering wind, the relentless, suffocating snow, and any moving shape that emerged from this hostile environment, all coalesced into a single, terrifying force. All on the same side, all against you. Pervitin, while it sharpened your visual images, making details unnervingly clear, simultaneously warped their meaning. Anything that moved, anything that registered on your heightened senses, became an immediate target, stripped of its humanity, its context, its very reason for being. The insidious word Untermensch, subhuman, a vile piece of propaganda plastered on posters back home, stopped being just a hateful political term. In the drug-fueled state of your mind, it merged with your heightened, chemically driven paranoia. Anyone not in your immediate unit, anyone who moved in the shadows or emerged from the blinding snow, was transformed into one more moving dot to shoot, an abstract threat without a face, without a soul, without a life. Yet, even as this terrifying transformation unfolded, a darker truth was slowly, subtly emerging. Soon, the most dangerous enemy you would face wouldn't be lurking outside the trench, in the shadows or the snow. It would be waiting, silently, insidiously, for you after each intoxicating, temporary high. During one particularly brutal push towards Moscow, the relentless pace reached an unbearable crescendo. You fought through 3, then 4 nights in a row, an unbroken continuum of freezing horror. Real sleep became a distant, almost mythical concept. You existed on a diet of meager canned food, endless cigarettes, the ever-present Pervitin, and the increasingly hollow promises that we're almost done, that victory was just over the next frozen ridge. The world shrank to the immediate, desperate need to keep moving, to keep fighting, to simply survive another chemically induced hour. Then, one desolate day, the inevitable happened. The supply trucks, usually a welcome if fleeting sight, never arrived. The Pervitin box, usually a source of grim reassurance in the sergeant's worn bag, was empty. No more white tablets, no more artificial energy to pull us through one more night. The realization hit you with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, terrifying emptiness in your stomach. Your body, which had been performing its duty with such unnatural efficiency, suddenly felt like a suspension bridge with all its supporting cables severed. The internal machinery that had been forced to churn at an impossible speed now collapsed, its relentless rhythm giving way to a slow, heavy, almost agonizing thudding in your chest. Your heart, once a tireless drum, now labored, each beat a painful, drawn-out echo. Your eye, once unnaturally wide and alert, now rebelled, refusing to stay open, struggling against the crushing weight of sleep. Your head spun with a dizzying, disorienting force, and your ears buzzed with a dull, incessant roar. Yet, despite this profound physical collapse, the harsh realities of war persisted. Guard duty still existed, the constant threat demanding your vigilance. Orders still crackled through the biting air, demanding obedience. And the enemy, omnipresent and unforgiving, still waited in the shadows. You watched, horrified, as the bear, the biggest, strongest man in your platoon, a titan of endurance, simply sat down in the icy mud. His massive shoulders shook with silent, agonizing sobs, tears freezing on his grimy cheeks. His strength, once a source of comfort to you all, had utterly abandoned him. Other men, their bodies betraying them entirely, shook so violently that their numb, trembling hands could no longer manage the simple task of sliding bullets into rifle magazines. Their own hands, once instruments of war, now utterly refused to obey, alienated from their will. Suddenly, with the abrupt withdrawal of the chemical, night returned to its full, terrifying size. It was long, impossibly cold, heavy with a weight that threatened to crush you, agonizingly slow, and crowded with every single fear, every doubt, every suppressed terror that the Pervitin had so effectively locked away behind a chemical door. The silence, once a mere absence of sound, now vibrated with unspoken dread. And in that terrifying, bedaubed, vulnerable moment, a new, dark path began to emerge for some. That's when some of you, desperate to escape the relentless, crushing embrace of this unyielding night, started seeking a grim, agonizing exit through the very wounds inflicted by the war. At the field hospital, a makeshift sanctuary of canvas and blood-stained cots near the front, the beds were always full. The air hung thick with the metallic scent of blood, the sterile tang of antiseptics, and the low moans of wounded men. Amidst this grim scene, you began to notice something unsettling, a pattern in the injuries that felt profoundly disturbing. There were interesting wounds, you observed, whispered about in hushed, knowing tones among the more cynical veterans. Bullets had pierced hands, calves, shoulders, just enough to cause significant injury, enough to warrant removal from the front, but not enough to be immediately life-threatening. They were injuries calculated for survival, a ticket out of the nightmare. Quiet, insidious rumors leaked from cot to cot, passed like a grim secret. "He shot himself," one whispered, a voice raspy with exhaustion. "Didn't want to stay in this night anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with a terrible understanding. You watched a young soldier on the cot next to you, his face a sickly greenish hue, his eyes hollowed out with the profound, desperate need for rest. He clawed weakly at his thin blanket, his voice a barely audible whisper, a broken plea. "Let me sleep, just one day, please." His desperation was palpable, a raw wound in the suffocating atmosphere of the tent. The army doctor, his own face a mask of profound exhaustion, his movements slow and deliberate, drew up a dose of morphine into a syringe. With a quiet, almost ritualistic motion, he slid the needle into the boy's vein, signing him into a different kind of night. A chemical one, perhaps, but one where the relentless thunder of gunfire and the bitter cold of the trenches could finally be silenced. On the doctor's rough wooden table, a stark, unsettling tableau was laid out. Pervitin, the drug that fueled the unending wakefulness, lay side by side with morphine and various sedatives. They were different methods, you realized, of bargaining with the same relentless, oppressive night. Different chemical contracts offered to weary souls. You sat on a hard wooden bench, observing the grim procession. Men, their faces pale with shock and pain, were carried to the rear, their injuries just enough to qualify for removal from the front lines. A cold, terrible clarity began to settle in your mind. In a war like this, where the night stretched endlessly and survival was a brutal, minute-by-minute struggle, pain was sometimes transformed into a plane ticket, a desperate escape route from the suffocating darkness. A thought, shocking in its brutality, flashed through your mind. If I just got hurt a little, a precise wound, I could finally sleep. The thought disgusted you, a dark stain on your conscience. But it didn't vanish. It lingered, an insidious whisper in the recesses of your mind, a testament to the sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion that had driven men to such desperate measures. And while frontline soldiers were negotiating with the endless night, using their own flesh, sacrificing their bodies for a moment of peace, in distant Berlin, another man was negotiating with the night, using an entirely different arsenal of drugs. Even amidst the chaos and brutality of the Eastern Front, fragmented whispers, carried by the invisible currents of rumor, began to reach your ears concerning the Führer's personal physician. He gets injections every day, a comrade would murmur, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and trepidation. The doctor's suitcase, another would add, is always full of drugs. These fragments of information painted a picture of a leader not just driven by ideology, but sustained by a powerful, hidden chemical regimen. On the crackling, static-laden radio, his voice, when it broadcast its relentless messages, never faltered. It never cracked with fatigue, never sagged under the weight of the immense war. There was no weakness, no perceptible tiredness in his delivery, only iron words, hammered into your ears with an unrelenting force, demanding obedience, inspiring a desperate, last-ditch resolve. He spoke of a will of steel, of a fight to the last man, of no retreat, no step back. It sounded, you observed with a grim, detached understanding, like the language of a brain that hadn't known true rest in years, a mind perpetually running on an artificial, destructive fuel. One officer, in a moment of dark, dangerous humor, once joked softly, "Don't worry, men. The man at the top is higher than all of you." A few nervous, hushed laughs rippled through the group. You knew that kind of joke. A subversive truth whispered in the dark could cost you everything. You pictured him, standing before a mirror in a luxurious Berlin apartment, red-rimmed eyes staring back, a hand perhaps shaking subtly, before he would straighten his uniform, compose himself, and step out to project an image of unshakable destiny onto the microphone. his voice reverberating across a nation. Night in Berlin, you knew, was fundamentally different from the brutal, freezing night at the front. It was filled with warm, golden light, the gleam of polished wood, the muted silence of heavy curtains. Yet, in one essential, terrifying way, you realized it was precisely the same. It was a drug-thinned sleeplessness, a chemically sustained wakefulness that blurred the lines between day and night for the highest echelons of power. A nation, you mused, was following a man who did not sleep. An army, fueled by white pills, was fighting under the influence of chemicals invented by its own scientists. And as the doses of these potent substances rose and fell at every level of the system, from the Führer down to the lowliest private, your shared reality, the very fabric of your world, began to fracture, to warp, and to ultimately crumble into countless, terrifying pieces. When the brutal, unforgiving Russian winter finally arrived, it brought with it a shift more profound than any battle. Time was no longer measured by the ticking hands of a clock, but by the relentless, all-consuming presence of the cold. The daytime sky transformed into the desolate color of ash, a dull, lifeless expanse. At night, the endless, pristine snow reflected a faint, ghostly glow, turning the entire landscape into a grainy, monochromatic photograph, a chilling scene of black and white. You stood guard in trenches that offered little protection, the biting wind cutting through your worn uniform, stealing what little warmth your body desperately clung to. Your hands, encased in flimsy gloves, were numb, clumsy, aching with a deep, bone-chilling cold. Your rifle, a heavy Sempour's metallic sentinel, was so frigid that its touch against bare skin threatened to rip flesh, leaving behind burning, raw wounds. Every breath you drew felt like inhaling crushed glass, a painful, freezing rasp that solidified in your lungs. Pervitin, that once reliable chemical ally, still circulated, passed around in hushed tones. But its magic had begun to wane in the face of this overwhelming adversary. It couldn't grow a layer of insulating fat under your skin. It couldn't mend the gaping holes in your worn-out boots. It couldn't repair your tattered, thin coats. It could only keep your eyes open, your mind artificially alert, while your body slowly, inevitably succumbed to the relentless assault of the elements. Men who had once run like machines, propelled by the chemical's promise, now sat frozen, their knees drawn up to their chests, their eyes staring blankly into the distance. Snow collected patiently on their helmets, dusted their slumped shoulders, nestled on their eyelashes, until they resembled grotesque statues, slowly becoming one with the frozen landscape. Sometimes, in the utter desolation of those winter nights, a man would simply die in that sitting posture, slumped against the trench wall, his eyes wide open, fixed in a glassy stare, as if still on watch, forever. The horror wasn't in a violent death, but in this quiet, frozen surrender. Winter nights here weren't frightening because of the darkness. You realized with chilling clarity they were frightening because of the overwhelming, relentless combination of white, cold, and an all-encompassing silence that slowly, inexorably, wore you down, stripping away not just your physical strength but your very will to live. And just as winter clenched its icy fist, tightening its grip around the collapsing army, your artificial night, the precarious, borrowed wakefulness of Pervitin, began its final, quiet disappearance, leaving you utterly exposed to the true darkness. In the hellish crucible of the encirclement near Stalingrad, or in the countless other frozen pockets scattered across the vast Eastern Front, you found yourselves trapped within the worst possible combination of horrors. There were no supplies to replenish your dwindling stores, no drugs to rekindle your flagging energy, precious little food to sustain your emaciated bodies, an overwhelming, all-consuming cold that seeped into your bones, and too many dead and dying bodies that littered the snow-covered landscape, each one a stark reminder of your impending fate. The very air you breathed was thick with the stench of death, desperation, and despair. Pervitin deliveries, once a regular, if sporadic, lifeline, slowed to a trickle, then ceased altogether. In the desperate calculus of survival, ammunition, dwindling rapidly, was deemed worth infinitely more than pills. The white tablets, once so abundant, ran out quietly, without ceremony, their absence leaving a gaping, terrifying void. Your bodies, pushed to the absolute breaking point, understood immediately. They began to call in the immense debt of sleep you had stolen from them over the past 2 grueling years, demanding payment all at once, in a sudden, overwhelming torrent of exhaustion. Men collapsed asleep on watch, their bodies giving out without warning, and never woke up again, their last breath mingling with the icy air. The snow, a silent, patient shroud, covered them gently, gradually turning them into an indistinguishable part of the frozen landscape, their humanity slowly erased by the elements. Some soldiers, their minds fracturing under the unbearable strain, began to speak of warm lights outside the trenches, illusory houses, flickering stoves, the comforting voices of loved ones calling their names. They would step out, drawn by these desperate hallucinations, following lights that only they could see, walking towards an unknown, chilling fate. A few were dragged back, shivering violently, their eyes wide and incoherent, muttering desperate, meaningless words. More, however, never came back at all. No one knew if they had succumbed to the merciless cold, or if they had simply walked into something far worse, something unimaginable, concocted within the shattered landscapes of their own minds. Inside your skull, the oppressive night no longer descended from the sky, a distant, external force. It stood behind your forehead, a pervasive, insidious presence, pouring whispers into your ears. Don't get up. Just stay down. Enough. It's enough. In that thin, terrifying borderland between sleep and death, between the brutal reality of the trenches and the chemical-induced wakefulness that had once sustained you, the very structure of the army began to crumble. Not just physically, but spiritually. Mind by shattered mind. Even amidst the crushing despair of Stalingrad, the officers, their voices raw and strained, continued to shout commands. "Hold the line," they bellowed, their words echoing weakly against the vast, indifferent expanse of snow and ruin. "No retreat," they insisted, though retreat was the only logical, human course of action. "Fight to the last bullet," they demanded, even as the ammunition dwindled to nothing. But their words, once imbued with the weight of authority, now fell into the endless snow and did not bounce back. They were absorbed, muffled, lost in the vast, terrible silence, stripped of their power and their meaning. Briefings, once sharp and decisive, were held in shaking bunkers, their flimsy walls threatening to give way. Lamp flames, flickering weakly, struggled to illuminate torn and smudged maps. Their strategic arrows now meaningless. Pencils, broken and dulled, lay uselessly beside them. Strategy, once focused on grand sweeps and audacious city captures, had shrunk to the desperate, immediate goal of simply lasting another day, a grim, minute-by-minute battle against oblivion. Some officers, still riding the last waves of their chemically induced highs, still clung to a fervent belief in pure will, convinced that sheer determination could overcome any obstacle. Others, however, had begun a more cynical, desperate game, carefully hiding small stashes of Pervitin for themselves, a grim personal cache to ensure they could survive just one more night, just one more terrifying moment. The men below, their illusions long since shattered, no longer saw these officers as untouchable figures of authority, carved from a different, harder substance. They saw, instead, other exhausted, trembling bodies, equally vulnerable, equally terrified, desperately trying to pretend they were made from something stronger, something more enduring than mere flesh and bone. Radio speeches, crackling with propaganda from distant Berlin, urged them to turn the tide, to reclaim the initiative, to fight for victory. But these words, hollow and meaningless, seemed to emanate from a different universe, a different night altogether. Your night, the one you actually inhabited, was much simpler, much more brutal cold, hunger, and an all-consuming fear that gnawed at your very soul. Each man, you realized, began to inhabit a private reality, a world of their own making within the collective nightmare. Some, their minds clinging to a desperate hope, still believed in the possibility of victory. Others, stripped of all grand illusions, believed only in their own immediate, personal survival, in the animalistic need to simply endure. And some, perhaps the most profoundly broken, didn't believe in anything at all, their spirits utterly crushed. Night, once a shared enemy that united you in common struggle, ceased to be a collective experience. It transformed into a private ordeal, a personal darkness that each man had to face alone. Some sank into its suffocating depths, embracing its oblivion. Some clung to its edges, desperately resisting its pull, and some, utterly broken, tried to desert it, seeking an escape that rarely came. By then, the army drawn on the map, the grand strategic entity, still existed on paper. But inside each individual soldier, the war had already fundamentally changed its shape, becoming an intimate, internal battle fought in the shattered landscape of the mind. On the long, agonizing retreat from the frozen plains of Russia, a chilling detachment began to settle over you. You would often look down, a strange sense of disembodied observation, and see your feet moving, one rhythmic step after another, churning through the endless snow and mud. Yet, you had no memory of consciously deciding to walk, no recollection of the deliberate act of putting one foot in front of the other. Your body, a weary automaton, simply continued its relentless motion, a vessel without a clear captain. The rifle on your shoulder, once a familiar extension of your will, transformed into a heavy, demanding parasite. It weighed you down, a relentless burden that demanded to be carried, to be cleaned, to be kept dry. You, the human, had become merely its host, a subservient caretaker to an inanimate object that now dictated your movements. When you finally managed to snatch a few minutes of troubled sleep, dozing off on your feet or in a freezing ditch, your dreams were not of home or family or peace. Instead, you dreamed you were still on guard duty, forever vigilant, forever waiting. And when you were actually on guard, standing watch in the biting wind, the lines between waking and sleeping blurred so completely that you weren't sure if you were truly awake, or simply continuing the same endless, exhausting dream. Night and day smeared into one indistinguishable, terrifying continuum. In those fleeting, tormented dreams, the comforting images of home, of your mother's face, of the life you once knew, had vanished entirely. Instead, you saw, with vivid, disturbing clarity, your first Pervitin pills, those small white tokens of a cheap, borrowed invincibility. They flickered in your mind, a haunting reminder of the Faustian bargain you had made. A comrade, his face etched with the same profound exhaustion as your own, once turned to you and asked, his voice a fragile whisper, "Do you remember my face back in the barracks before all this?" You tried to picture him, to conjure a clear image, but all you could see was a helmeted figure, his face wiped blank, a featureless phantom in the swirling fog of war. Your collective memories of the war had coalesced into one long, continuous night. You could no longer pinpoint which battle, which nameless village, which specific campaign. It was all that night, an unending, monolithic darkness that had stretched for years, swallowing up all individual experiences into its vast, consuming maw. When your sense of self shatters into countless pieces of night, when your identity becomes so inextricably linked to this endless darkness, the question, "Who was I before the war?" no longer has a clear, discernible answer. That person, that former self, seemed to have been lost somewhere in the endless, chemically induced night, perhaps never to be found again. As you eventually withdrew from the vast, frozen plains of Russia and slowly began the long, agonizing journey westward, the external sounds of war gradually, mercifully, began to recede. Artillery fire became rarer, the distant rumble fading into a whisper. But in the shattered landscape of your mind, the machine guns never slowed. Their relentless chatter, their staccato rhythm of death, continued unabated, a phantom orchestra of destruction playing on an endless loop. You found yourself in a transit barracks in East Prussia, a place that, on the surface, offered a semblance of quiet and safety. No alarms sounded, no shells fell, no distant explosions rent the air. Yet, you would wake up in the dead of night, jolted awake by bursts of imaginary gunfire so real, so vivid, that your hands would instinctively grope for a rifle that wasn't there. The echoes of battle, you realized, had taken root deep within your skull, forever playing their devastating symphony. Every time you closed your eyes, seeking a fleeting moment of peace, your wildest, most drug-fueled nights of the war would replay themselves with terrifying clarity. They were like damaged film reels, jerky and distorted, the images flickering erratically, the sound cutting in and out, a nightmare on an endless loop. The horrors you had witnessed, the actions you had performed under the influence of Pervitin were no longer confined to the past. They lived, vibrant and terrifying, in the present of your shattered mind. You met old trenchmates again, their faces older, their eyes bearing the same haunted, vacant stare as your own. You didn't tell stories of glory or heroism. Those words, you knew, were empty, meaningless. Instead, you spoke of tiny, visceral details, the raw, unfiltered experiences that had burrowed deep into your souls. Do you remember the smell of blood in the snow? One would ask, his voice barely a whisper. The way the light felt after 3 days without sleep. Another would add, sharing a silent, profound understanding of a shared, unspeakable past. Night. You realized, no longer depended on the turning of the earth, on the absence of the sun from the sky. It lived behind your eyes, behind your forehead, a pervasive, insidious presence, trickling into your meager meals, into the moments of fragile silence, and into the brief, troubled naps you managed to snatch. Even without the pills, your body, having learned its grim lessons too well, would sometimes flip back into that terrifyingly over-alert state. Your heart would race, your hands would grow cold and clammy, your nerves would buzz with a manic energy, as if it had learned to produce its own internal war, its own devastating chemical cocktail. So, when people later, with well-meaning but utterly misplaced optimism, declared, "The war's over," you knew, with chilling certainty, that they were only speaking of the part of the war that existed outside your skin. For you, the internal battle raged on, an unending, phantom conflict. When Germany finally surrendered, the news arrived with a flurry of bells ringing in distant towns, the booming voices of speeches crackling over compromised radio waves, the symbolic flutter of white flags raised in hesitant surrender, and the solemn scratch of signatures on official documents. History textbooks, you knew, would later describe it as a new dawn, a clean break, the beginning of a brighter era. But to you, standing amidst the ruins of a shattered world, that proclaimed dawn felt more like a flimsy poster, brightly colored and optimistic, hastily glued over a deeply cracked wall. The crack, you understood with chilling clarity, was still there underneath, a profound, irreparable fissure running through the very fabric of your existence. You were discharged, or perhaps captured and then eventually released, whichever version history chose to record. It mattered little to you. The practical reality was that you found yourself back in a village that bombing raids had already half erased. Its familiar landscape transformed into a desolate, scarred wasteland. People, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, would sometimes ask, "How was the war at the front?" But you didn't know how to answer. The words that came to mind felt inadequate, hollow, in your head. There was only one thing, one pervasive, all-encompassing memory, a long, continuous night that had stretched from 1940 until... You still didn't know when, perhaps never truly ending. Some people, their eyes hard and unforgiving, hated you, blaming you for the destruction, for the moral collapse. Others, their faces softened by pity, offered a fleeting moment of compassion, though they could never truly understand. And some, perhaps the most common, simply didn't want to talk about it at all, preferring to bury the uncomfortable truths in a shallow grave of silence. Whatever their stance, one thing was unmistakably clear: they slept better than you did. They had days and nights, distinct segments of time when to go to bed and when to wake up, a natural rhythm of existence that had been utterly stolen from you. You, however, had one continuous, unyielding night, stretching from that desolate winter of 1940 and continuing to this very moment. Peace, you realized with a bitter irony, had indeed given you a bed, a physical place to rest your weary body, but it had provided no switch, no magical lever, to turn off the relentless, internal night that continued to rage within you. In the nascent post-war Germany, a country struggling to find its footing amidst the rubble and the ghosts of its past, the night was slowly beginning to fill with new, uncertain sounds. The distant clang of tram bells, the sharp arguments of rebuilding citizens, the tentative strains of music from reopened cafes, the raucous, desperate laughter of drunks seeking to forget. All these sounds attempted to fill the void left by the war. But in the landscape of your mind, these new sounds were always accompanied by the ghostly echo of distant artillery, a persistent, chilling rumble that refused to fade. You lay on a real mattress now, under a solid, unbroken roof, a luxury that still felt alien after years of sleeping in mud and snow. Yet, despite the physical comfort, you saw no snowflakes falling outside your window, but you felt the familiar, bone-deep cold, as if you were still huddled in a freezing trench, the wind cutting through your inadequate uniform. After too many sleepless nights, too many hours spent staring at the ceiling in the quiet dark, you began to understand, with a profound and unsettling clarity, why you had swallowed that first Pervitin pill so easily. The old temptation, the insidious whisper of just one more pill, never truly died. It lay dormant, a venomous seed buried deep within your psyche, waiting for moments of weakness, for the return of the crushing darkness. On the black market, in the smoky back rooms of illicit bars, in certain quiet, discreet clinics, people whispered about old drugs, about new, experimental concoctions, about ways to forget the trauma, ways to work harder, ways to push beyond human limits. You stayed away. A conscious decision born of bitter experience. But every time you passed those places, every time a hushed conversation about such things reached your ears, a small, involuntary twitch would seize your chest. It was a physical reminder that you had once been deeply in debt to the night, and that you had used chemicals, those innocent-looking white tablets, to merely delay the inevitable, crushing payment. People around you spoke of rebuilding the country, of an economic miracle, of a brighter future stretching out before them. To you, the future was not a shining beacon of hope, but simply a series of nights, one after another. Your only hope was that these new nights would be kinder, less brutal, less filled with echoes of the past than the old ones. And then, a new set of whispers began to reach you. Stories of secret programs, clandestine experiments using drugs, hypnosis, and disturbing mind experiments. A new type of war. Fought not on battlefields, but within the fragile confines of the human mind. As the world slowly reconfigured itself after the devastation of World War II, a chilling new form of conflict began to emerge. One fought not with tanks and planes, but in the shadows, within the human mind itself. Newspapers, with their carefully worded hints and veiled suggestions, spoke of psychological warfare, of unsettling mind control techniques, of dark experiments on prisoners and soldiers, of elusive truth serums, and of course, of new performance enhancers. The language was different, but the echoes were profoundly, terrifyingly familiar. Former enemies and former allies alike. It seemed were now all drawn to the same dark fascination, how to control the very essence of night and day. The delicate balance within another person's mind. They sought to manipulate consciousness, to extend wakefulness, to suppress fear, to rewrite loyalty. You read the articles, your eyes scanning the words, and familiar terms sprang out at you from the page. Amphetamines, stimulants, psychotomimetics, distant, more sophisticated cousins of Pervitin, now joined by newcomers like LSD and a host of other mind-altering substances, all deployed in the new, insidious arenas of the Cold War. The world surged forward into a new age of technological marvels, rockets piercing the atmosphere, the terrifying threat of nuclear bombs, satellites silently circling the Earth. Yet, underneath this gleaming veneer of progress, the old, fundamental question remained, gnawing at the edges of human morality. Can we make soldiers, spies, prisoners, or even ordinary citizens more efficient, more compliant, more utterly controllable? They might not call it Pervitin anymore. You mused, a grim smile touching your lips. They would invent new names, elaborate code words, their dark secrets locked away in safe rooms, hidden deep within government archives. But the core idea, the chilling principle of renting human bodies and human wills to chemicals, to substances designed to alter perception and performance, remained precisely the same. You were not a scientist, nor a politician. You understood. You were simply a man who had lived deep inside a drugged army, who had experienced firsthand the profound, devastating cost of that chemical bargain. So, the only thing you felt entitled to offer, the only true legacy of your endless night, was a final, haunting question. A quiet warning whispered into the wind, hoping it might reach those who, even now, were blindly walking a similar path. If you were asked to choose one single image to encapsulate the entirety of your war, it wouldn't be a fluttering flag, a grand, stoic monument carved in stone, or even the chilling, iconic face of the Führer. No. The image that surfaces, persistent and haunting, is much simpler, much more visceral, a muddy, desolate road stretching endlessly into the dark, shrouded in a pervasive, heavy silence. It would be lined with countless silhouettes, their steel helmets catching the faint, ghostly glow of a sky that never brightened, walking with wide, open eyes, their faces obscured, their individual struggles hidden, moving forward without truly knowing when or if they would ever stop. Pervitin, you understand now, is merely the name of a drug, a chemical compound. But the feeling it created, the false sense of boundless energy, of invincibility, of suppressed fear, and the devastating, soul-crushing price it demanded afterward. That profound experience doesn't fit neatly inside a brand name. Can't be contained by a mere label. You, like so many others, wanted to pass through the brutal crucible of war faster, to experience less fear, to feel less pain, to silence the nagging doubts that gnawed at your conscience. So, you bought extra wakefulness, the chemical promise of extended endurance in the brutal, unforgiving reality of it all. However, you weren't buying more waking hours. You were buying extra night, an extension of the darkness that would ultimately consume you. That night, that profound, chemically induced darkness, lives on within you, a persistent, indelible shadow. It manifests in startled awakenings, your heart suddenly pounding, your senses screaming an unheard alarm. It surfaces in the empty, faraway stares on crowded train rides, your gaze fixed on something only you can see. It lingers in the sudden, inexplicable silences that fall halfway through sentences, your mind momentarily lost in the echoes of a past that refuses to die. When you see people now, in this modern, bustling world, eagerly taking pills to work all night, to play all night, to optimize their performance, to push their bodies and minds beyond natural limits, a familiar, unsettling ache forms in your chest, and you just want to reach out to them, to whisper a quiet, urgent question, born of your own profound, bitter experience. Are you absolutely sure that night you're so eagerly buying will end when you want it to? Or will there come a day when that night, once invited in, never truly gives you a real morning back at all? Your war, on paper, is finished, recorded in history books, its battles fought and its victors declared. But every single time you gather the fragments of your memory and tell this story, you know, with chilling certainty, that a small piece of that unending night passes from you to whoever is listening. If there is another truth that history is allowed to sleep in the dark, which story do you want us to wake up next?